Mad cow disease became possible when an industrial food system took a grass-eating animal and fed it processed remains of other animals. That single practice turned a hidden molecular error into one of the most disturbing public health scandals of the late 20th century. The phrase "turn cows into cannibals" is not perfect biology, but it captures the shock people felt when they learned how cattle feed had been made. Cows did not become dangerous by nature. They were pushed into a rendering cycle where animal remains were ground into meat and bone meal and fed back into livestock. In the United Kingdom, that efficiency-driven loop helped spread the fatal brain disease called Bovine Spongiform Encephalopathy, or BSE, across the national herd. By the end of this video, you will know how prions work, why feed policy made the epidemic explode, and why the political fallout still matters. The first part of the story sounds almost unreal because the infectious agent behind BSE was not a bacterium and not a virus. It was a prion, which is a misfolded protein that can trigger other proteins to misfold in the same destructive pattern. That detail matters because prions behave in ways that break ordinary public intuition about contamination. They can resist normal cooking, resist many standard disinfection methods, and spread without looking dramatic in the way people expect from infection. Once prions build up in nervous tissue, the brain develops sponge-like holes, neurological function collapses, and the disease is fatal. In cattle, symptoms can include strange behavior, trouble standing or walking, hypersensitivity, and steady neurological decline. The public called it mad cow disease because of the behavior changes, but the true process was slow brain destruction, not theatrical frenzy. The big question is how that misfolded protein got amplified so widely. Scientists generally agree that infected animal tissues entered feed and were then recycled through cattle populations in the United Kingdom. The exact first spark remains debated. Some researchers long suspected a link to scrapian sheep, while others argue that a rare spontaneous prion event in cattle may have been the starting point. That origin question still matters scientifically, but the mechanism of spread became far clearer than the origin. Feeding ruminant-derived protein back to cattle created the perfect amplification loop. Even if the first infective material came from only a rare event, the feed system multiplied it across herds. That is the true horror in the story. A biological accident may have been rare, but policy and profit turned rarity into national exposure. The first recognized BSE cases in the United Kingdom were identified in 1986, though infection almost certainly began years earlier. Once surveillance improved, reported cases climbed sharply. The United Kingdom became the epicenter of the crisis, with more than 104,000 confirmed cattle cases recorded between 1986 and 2015. More than 3,000 herds were affected. At the epidemic peak in 1993, nearly 1,000 new cases were being reported every week. Those are staggering numbers, and they count only confirmed disease, not every animal that may have been infected before controls fully tightened. For a while, the disaster still looked like an agricultural problem rather than a human one. Then the story crossed the species barrier and changed forever. In 1996, authorities announced that a new human illness called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob Disease, or vCJD, was linked to BSE contaminated beef. That announcement transformed the issue from a farm crisis into a public health catastrophe and a political crisis at the same time. Variant CJD is a fatal prion disease in people, and it usually struck much younger patients than classic sporadic CJD. Early symptoms often included psychiatric changes or sensory problems, followed by movement disorder, dementia, neurological decline, and death. Average survival after onset has usually been around a year to a little over a year. Worldwide case totals remain small compared with many infections, but the lethality is absolute. Official counts vary a little by date, yet roughly 233 cases worldwide are commonly reported, with the great majority in the United Kingdom and 78 primary UK cases often cited. Numbers alone, however, do not explain why BSE scarred public trust so deeply. The political damage came from repeated reassurance that ran ahead of scientific certainty. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the British public heard again and again that beef was safe. Some officials believed the species barrier would protect humans. Others believed that removing the most infectious tissues from the food chain would solve the problem. But later inquiries and retrospective analysis heavily criticized the culture of reassurance that had taken hold. Officials were trying to prevent panic, defend agriculture, and protect consumer confidence while the science was still uncertain. That gap between uncertainty and reassurance is why the word cover-up still clings to the story. You do not need a movie-style mastermind to have a real institutional failure. Public inquiries described secrecy, delay, fragmented responsibility, and excessive optimism. Science always evolves, but honest risk communication requires telling the public when uncertainty is still real. In the BSE crisis, that often did not happen clearly enough while millions kept eating beef products during the years when exposure likely occurred. Eventually, the response became sweeping and painful. Feed bans were introduced, though early versions had loopholes and enforcement problems. Specified risk materials such as brain and spinal tissues were removed from the human food chain. Older cattle were excluded from food use under the over 30-month rule. Large culls followed, and millions of cattle were slaughtered as infected, exposed, or precautionary animals. British beef exports were devastated for years. The economic cost reached into the billions, and the human cost included farmer trauma, fear among consumers, and a deep wound to trust in government food oversight. BSE also changed science itself. It reshaped how prion disease was understood in medicine and veterinary science, and it pushed countries to tighten feed regulation around the world. Rules against feeding most mammalian proteins to ruminants became far more serious after the epidemic. The case also taught a broader systems lesson. Food production can create new pathways for disease amplification long before the public notices anything wrong. When industrial efficiency outruns biological caution, one invisible error can scale into a national disaster. There were also long-tail fears that kept the story alive long after the peak case numbers fell. Prion diseases can incubate for years or even decades, which made forecasting terrifyingly uncertain. Research into asymptomatic carriage raised concern that some people might carry infectivity without developing obvious clinical disease on the first expected timeline. That possibility affected blood donation policies and surgical sterilization practices well beyond the worst years of the outbreak. Even today, origin questions remain partly unresolved. Later, atypical BSE cases in several countries, often in older cattle, support the idea that spontaneous bovine prion disease can occur rarely. If that is true, then the historical lesson becomes even harsher. A rare spontaneous event may be unavoidable, but a feed system that recycles animal tissues back into cattle can turn the rare into the widespread. That is why mad cow disease still matters as more than a strange 1990s memory. It was a collision of industrial agriculture, prion biology, government reassurance, commercial pressure, and the limits of public trust. Cows did not choose cannibalism. They were placed in a profit-driven recycling system, and the disease that followed showed how modern food systems can magnify hidden biological danger. If you want the next disease history story where one policy decision reshaped global health rules, subscribe so you catch the next upload. The rendering system, at the center of the crisis, deserves close attention because it made contamination scalable. Rendering takes animal remains that would otherwise be waste and processes them into usable materials such as meat and bone meal. In principle, efficiency looks sensible. In practice, feeding ruminant-derived material back to cattle built a biological loop with almost no respect for how prions behave. Because prions are unusually resilient, ordinary assumptions about heat and processing were not enough protection. That is one reason BSE unnerved scientists and the public alike. The usual comfort line, surely processing will kill it, was not reliable here. Once the epidemic expanded, every new weekly case hinted at how many infections might still be incubating silently. That lag between infection and visible disease helped make the outbreak feel uncontrollable. By the time a cow showed symptoms, the dangerous feed practices that infected it might have happened years earlier. That delayed visibility also made policy response slower and more politically tempting to soften. Governments prefer crises with fast answers. BSE offered long incubation, uncertain numbers, and a mechanism most voters had never even heard of. The 1996 link to variant vCJD intensified every fear because it suggested the species barrier had failed in the most terrifying direction possible. This was no longer about cattle welfare or farm economics alone. It was about whether a staple food in millions of homes had carried a fatal brain disease. Public confidence does not survive that kind of revelation easily. The response measures, from feed bans to slaughter policies, show how expensive delayed prevention can become. Once trust collapses, governments are forced to act on a scale that would have looked extreme years earlier. Millions of cattle were culled. Exports suffered. Farmers absorbed economic and emotional shock. Consumers absorbed the knowledge that reassurance had been stronger than certainty. Even after case numbers fell, the crisis left a permanent imprint on risk governance. Blood donation rules changed in several countries because of concern about asymptomatic carriage. Surgical sterilization policy changed because prions raised difficult questions about transmission and decontamination. Food regulation changed because one lesson became impossible to ignore: a feed system can amplify danger long before clinical cases reveal the scale. The origin mystery also matters for future planning. If the first BSE agent came from sheep scrapie, that points toward species crossover inside a careless feed chain. If the first agent came from a rare spontaneous bovine case, that points toward an even harsher reality. Rare spontaneous biological events may be impossible to eliminate completely, so the job of policy is to stop industrial systems from magnifying them. Either way, the same conclusion survives. The catastrophe was not created by one cow acting strangely. It was created by a system that treated herbivores as protein recycling units and treated uncertainty as a public relations problem. That combination is why mad cow disease still reads like a warning for every modern food chain. Invisible risk grows fastest where profit, complexity, and weak transparency meet. BSE also changed how the public thinks about the phrase safe enough. Before the crisis, many people assumed food safety meant visible cleanliness and the absence of immediate poisoning. After the crisis, it became harder to ignore that some risks are invisible, delayed, and built into the structure of production itself. A steak can look normal, a farm can look orderly, and a national policy can sound rational while a long incubation disaster is already underway. That lesson remains painfully current. Surveillance matters because you cannot manage what you do not measure. Feed rules matter because prevention at the system level is cheaper than mass slaughter later. Transparent communication matters because once reassurance outruns evidence, trust collapses faster than officials expect. The numbers from the UK epidemic, more than 84,000 confirmed cattle cases and over 35,000 affected herds, are not just statistics. They are a record of what happens when a biological warning sign meets commercial momentum and delayed honesty. Even the relatively small human total, roughly 233 recognized vCJD cases worldwide, carried a moral weight far beyond the raw count because every case was fatal. That is why mad cow disease remains a benchmark for regulatory failure. It showed that low probability does not mean low consequence. It showed that species barriers are not promises. And it showed that public confidence is easiest to spend at the exact moment leaders should be conserving it. What began as a feed practice became a national lesson in humility before biology. Prions did not care about ministerial confidence, export targets, or the comforting story that modern systems were too advanced to make such an error. They moved through the openings the system gave them. That is why the BSE crisis still matters wherever efficiency is praised faster than precaution. In that sense, mad cow disease was not a freak event floating outside modernity. It was modernity under pressure, showing what happens when industrial shortcuts meet an agent almost nobody fully respects in time. The outbreak forced regulators to remember that nature does not negotiate with confidence. It only responds to conditions. And the conditions created by feed recycling gave prions far too much room. That is the lasting warning hidden inside every chart from the UK epidemic. The tragedy also reframed responsibility. Blame could not sit only with the farm, only with the lab, or only with the consumer. The whole chain mattered, from feed design to surveillance to ministerial honesty. That systems view is one of the most valuable legacies of the disaster. That is why the scandal still belongs in public health, veterinary medicine, and political history all at once. It crossed every boundary a modern government hoped would keep one sector's mistake contained. The barriers failed, and the lesson spread farther than the disease. That is why BSE is studied not only as a disease outbreak, but as a failure of systems thinking. That lesson alone explains why the crisis still appears in textbooks decades later.